They built a shrine around the ghost of a law. Commander Eva Rostova watched the ghost flicker on the main viewer of the patrol cutter Vigil. It was a phantom of gravimetric distortion, a deep hum in the quantum foam that should have been silent. Her ship floated in the legally mandated gloom of the obsidian anchorage, a graveyard of forgotten wars where stellar radiation scraped against the hull like a predator's claw. The mandate was simple: keep everyone out. The anchorage was a tomb, not a treasure chest, and its currents were famously hostile to navigation. A deep, resonant energy signature had bloomed from the core of the debris field. This was a place where sleeping things were best left to their slumber. Architas, the Vigil's fleet mind, rendered the anomaly as a calm blue sigil on her command console. It pulsed in time with a rhythm that felt unnervingly organic. The stakes were as clear as the void outside. A discovery here could rewrite history or ignite a war. Rostova's duty was to the concordance, to the fragile peace treaties that kept the wolves of the galaxy at bay. She would not allow this place to become a spark. The anchorage was a paradox of celestial mechanics and ancient violence. Millennia ago, a battle of unimaginable scale had shattered a dwarf galaxy, leaving behind a nebula of shattered warships and exotic matter. It was tidally locked to a neutron star, whose magnetic field was so powerful it warped local space-time. Navigation was suicide for any ship without the latest compensation drives. The Concordance had declared it a quarantine zone a century ago, a warning buoyed by the husks of pirate vessels that had tried and failed to plunder its depths. They were not keeping people out, they were keeping something in. Report. Rostova said, her voice a low counterpoint to the bridge's quiet thrum. Her exo-lieutenant Commander Jax stood beside her, his face a mask of practiced calm that didn't quite hide the awe in his eyes. He was a veteran of a dozen border skirmishes, a man who had seen plasma burn holes in reality, yet the view held him rapt. The ghost in the machine was older than their civilization. The resonance is stable, Ensign Kyrian offered from his sensor station. He was young, with eyes that still held the fire of academic curiosity. It's not a natural phenomenon, Commander. The waveform is too structured. It's broadcasting, but on a carrier wave so ancient our universal translators can't even find a foothold. He pushed a strand of dark hair from his forehead, his focus absolute. The signal was a perfect recursive equation. Architas interjected its synthesized voice, smooth and devoid of human wonder. The energy output matches theoretical models for a Class 7 dormant core. Such a power source has not been documented outside of pre-diaspora archives. I advise extreme caution. The potential for catastrophic energy release is 63%. The AI's logic was a cold, necessary anchor in a sea of myth. It counted the odds while the crew felt the legend. Any signs of the vultures? Rostova asked, her gaze sweeping across the tactical display. The anchorage was a magnet for the desperate and the greedy. If the Vigil had detected the signal, others had too. A ledger of past encounters scrolled through her mind, a tally of warnings and destroyed ships. Jax pointed to a series of faint trails at the edge of the quarantine zone. Rust hounds. 3 corvettes running silent. And, oh hell. Another contact appeared, this one accelerating on a reckless burn. The Children of Sol. One of their converted freighters, the Martyr's Flame. They're not even trying to hide. He grimaced, the lines around his eyes deepening. The rust hounds were predictable scavengers, hyenas picking at a lion's kill. The Children of Sol were something else entirely. They were a death cult that worshipped pre-diaspora humanity as vengeful gods. They saw relics like this not as history to be preserved, but as divine weapons to be unleashed. The law was simply a challenge to their faith. A civilian freighter, the Stardust Drifter, hailed them from the edge of the system. Its captain, a woman named Alara, her face weary and lined with the stress of deep space travel, appeared on a secondary screen. Concordance Patrol Vigil, we're reading that energy spike from out here. My passengers are scared. They're pilgrims heading to Sanctuary. Is the passage safe? Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Rostova saw the faces of families in the background, their quiet journey interrupted by a ghost. A new power rises from the ashes of the old. Rostova held the woman's gaze. Maintain your current position, Stardust Drifter. The Concordance is managing the situation. The route to Sanctuary remains secure. Do not deviate from your flight plan. She cut the channel, her jaw tight. These were the people she was sworn to protect. Their fear was a currency the cultists and pirates would gladly spend. The problem was escalating. A third faction now entered the fray. A priority communique flashed on her console, encrypted with the highest level of diplomatic severity. It was from the Xylan hegemony, a legalistic avian species that prized order above all else. The message was concise and chilling. They declared the anomaly a potential treaty violation. They demanded the Concordance contain or destroy the source, or they would intervene with their own fleet. Their definition of containment was notoriously thorough. Architas Project a course, Rostova ordered. Take us into the anchorage. Minimum power, follow the gravimetric null channel. Jax charted last cycle. She had to get to the source before the rust hounds could defile it, before the children of Saul could worship it to death, and before the Xylans could sterilize it from existence. Commander, that channel is unstable, Jax warned. The star's magnetic field is in flux. We'll risk it, Rostova replied. The alternative is letting one of them write the first chapter of this story. She would not let this discovery begin with theft, fanaticism, or bureaucratic erasure. Her duty was to the truth, and the truth was buried in that mechanical graveyard. The law had to be the first voice heard. The Vigil was a small ship, a dagger in a fight that might require a sword. But it was sharp, and its crew was tested. As they slipped past the quarantine buoys, the debris field loomed before them. It was a cathedral of wreckage, vast and silent. Twisted hulls of ancient dreadnoughts, some kilometers long, drifted in a slow cosmic ballet. Crystalline structures of unknown origin pulsed with faint, trapped light. Its silence was a promise and a threat. Kirian's console chimed a note of discovery. Commander, I've isolated the source. Visuals coming up now. The main screen resolved, piercing through the nebula's haze. It was a ship, but that word was insufficient. It was a monument carved from obsidian-hued armor, its lines both elegant and brutally functional. It was impossibly huge, easily 10 times the size of a Concordance battleship, yet it showed no signs of the battle that had destroyed its brethren. It was pristine, untouched by time or violence. Ancient sigils glowed with a soft internal luminescence along its hull. They were characters from a proto-human language Kirian had only seen in shielded archives. One symbol was dominant, repeated across the vessel's spine, a balanced scale held within a circle. It was a symbol of judgment, of order. This was not a warship built for conquest. It was designed for something else. By the founders. Jax whispered, all pretense of composure gone. The legends are true. What legends? Rostova asked, never taking her eyes off the screen. The judiciary class, Jax, said, his voice low with reverence. The saint ships. They were said to be more than vessels. They were archives, arbitrators. They carried the great library of laws. The stories say they didn't fire weapons. They passed judgment. A weapon that does not kill is the most terrifying weapon of all. Architas's voice cut through the awe. Analysis of the hull composition is inconclusive. The material does not match any known element or alloy. It is theoretically impossible. The vessel is absorbing all sensor scans and ambient radiation. It is for all intents and purposes a perfect blackbody. The AI was confronted with a reality that defied its data, a ghost that broke the rules of physics. Before Rostova could process this, the tactical display flared red. "Hostile contact," Jax shouted. "The Rust Hounds are making their move. They've launched boarding pods on a direct intercept with the artifact." The scavengers were brazen, hoping to claim the prize while the Concordance was still trying to understand it. They saw a treasure, not a testament. Simultaneously, the Martyr's flame accelerated its engines, burning with suicidal intensity. "The Children of Sol are on an attack vector," Architas reported. "They are broadcasting a litany. They call the ancient ship the Hand of Sol and believe its awakening requires a sacrifice of blood and fire. Their devotion was a weapon aimed at the heart of history." Rostova's mind raced. She couldn't engage both targets at once, and a direct assault might damage the very thing she was trying to protect. The Xylan fleet was minutes away from jumping into the system, their patience razor thin. She was trapped between pirates, zealots, and bureaucrats. The law was silent, and chaos was screaming. The choices of the present are judged by the ghosts of the past. Kyrian, focus on that broadcast from the ship, she ordered. "You said it was an equation. Is there a solution?" Her gamble was a long one. She couldn't outfight her enemies, so she would have to outthink them. The key was not in her weapons, but in understanding the sleeping giant before them. "It's not just an equation," Commander Kyrian replied, his fingers flying across his console. "It's a logical proof, a question about jurisprudence. It's asking for a ruling." The ancient ship was not inert. It was waiting. It was testing them. The Rust Hound pods closed in their magnetic clamps, ready to latch on to the obsidian hull. The Children of Sol's freighter began to glow, its reactor being deliberately pushed to overload. They intended to detonate their ship as a fiery offering. The Xylan diplomatic channel began screaming for a response. "The proof," Rostova said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "It posits a scenario. 3 parties claim ownership of a resource that cannot be divided. One by right of discovery, one by right of faith, and one by right of law. It asks who is the rightful steward." Kyrian read the translation, his eyes wide. The question was their exact predicament. This was the lock. This was the key. Her answer would determine the future of this system. It was a test of worthiness, a trial by an ancient silent judge. Rostova took a breath, the weight of a forgotten age settling on her shoulders. She looked at the pirates seeking profit, the cultists seeking apocalypse, and the legalists seeking control. She would teach them all the meaning of the law. Architas Rostova began, her voice ringing with newfound clarity. "Open a channel to the artifact. Use the carrier wave Kyrian isolated. Prepare to transmit my response." She would not answer with force or with dogma. She would answer with the one thing the judiciary-class vessel was built to understand. She would answer with justice. The bridge of the vigil became a crucible of intent. Outside, the Rust Hound corvettes opened fire, not at the artifact, but at the vigil. Green bolts of plasma splashed against the patrol ship's kinetic barriers, the impacts shaking the deck plates. The scavengers wanted to distract them, to force them into a fight, while their boarding parties completed their work. The shields bled energy, their percentage dropping with each hit. "Shields at 82%, Jax called out, his knuckles white on his console. "They're trying to pin us down." "Ignore them," Rostova commanded, her focus unwavering. "Kyrian, is the channel ready?" "It is, Commander." "The ship, it's listening. The energy signature is resonating with our transmission frequency." The blue sigil on the main screen pulsed faster, a heartbeat in the void. It knew they were speaking its language. The ancient mind was stirring from its eons of slumber. The moral calculus of the relic's question was the entire battle. The right of discovery belonged to the Rust Hounds, who sought only to exploit it. The right of faith belonged to the Children of Sol, who wished to immolate it in their fervor. The right of law belonged to the Xylan hegemony, who would quarantine it into oblivion. All three were forms of destruction. All three were selfish. A ledger is kept for every action, and every debt is paid. My answer, Rostova said, her voice clear and strong, as if she were in a courtroom, not the heart of a firefight. Stewardship is not a right to be claimed, but a duty to be earned. The discoverer who plunders is a thief. The believer who destroys is a heretic. The lawmaker who buries knowledge is a tyrant. She paused, letting the words sink into the humming silence of the bridge. She was defining not who was worthy, but who was not. It was a judgment, a mirror of the ship's own purpose. The rightful steward, she continued, is the one who preserves the resource for the benefit of all who accepts the burden of its protection, without claiming the privilege of its ownership. Stewardship is sacrifice. It is a promise to the future, written on the ledger of the past. As she spoke, the rust-hound boarding pods reached the obsidian hull of the Saint ship. Their magnetic clamps fired, seeking purchase, but they found none. The surface of the ancient vessel remained inert, its impossible material refusing to acknowledge their existence. The pods bounced off like stones, tumbling uselessly into the void. The scavenger's greed had found nothing to hold. At the same time, the martyr's flame reached the apex of its suicidal run. Its reactor core went critical, a blinding white light erupting from its frame. But instead of a wave of destructive energy, something impossible happened. The light bent. It flowed towards the obsidian ship, not as an explosion, but as a river of pure energy. The Saint ship did not block the blast. It drank it. Their fire was a gift it had long awaited. The soft internal luminescence of the sigils on its hull brightened the light flowing through them like blood through veins. The blue pulse on the vigil's screen turned a brilliant, steady gold. The ancient ship had accepted their offering not as a sacrifice of death, but as a transfer of power. The cultists had intended a baptism of fire. They had delivered a feast. A new voice filled the bridge of the vigil. It was not broadcast over the comms. It spoke directly inside their minds, a resonance of pure information, ancient and impossibly vast. It was calm, measured, and utterly absolute. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The neutron star's magnetic field, the swirling debris, the radiation. All of it seemed to dim for a moment, as the Saint ship, the Justiciar, came alive. Panels slid open along its hull, revealing not weapon ports, but intricate crystalline arrays that glowed with the light of 1,000 captured stars. Its dormant core, now fed by the cultist's sacrifice, spun up to full power. On the tactical display, the situation had inverted. The rust-hound corvettes, their boarding plan a failure, began to turn their captains, realizing they had kicked a nest of gods. The crippled, energy-drained hulk of the Martyr's Flame drifted its crew alive but powerless, their ultimate act of faith consumed and repurposed. And on the edge of the system, the first of the Xylan warships, translated from hyperspace, its formidable profile a promise of overwhelming force. The Xylan commander, a stern-faced avian named Vorlog, appeared on the main screen. His voice was like stones grinding together. Concordance vessel, you have failed to contain the anomaly. It is now active. By the terms of the Intersystem Security Pact, we are assuming command of this sector. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. Their arrival was precise, their authority absolute. They saw an awakened weapon, and their only response was to cage it. A law untested is merely an opinion, but the Justiciar was not a weapon. It was a court, and court was now in session. Before Rostova could respond to the Xylans, the crystalline arrays on the ancient ship pulsed once. No weapons fired. No energy beams lanced through the darkness. There was only a subtle shift in the fabric of space-time, a recalculation of reality itself. The rust-hound corvettes, turning to flee, suddenly found their escape vectors were gone. Their navigation systems showed them accelerating, but their position relative to the Vigil and the Justiciar did not change. They were running in place, their engines burning fuel for a journey that had no destination. They were caught in a localized temporal loop, a prison made of their own panicked flight. The Justiciar's voice echoed in their minds again, its judgment cold and clear. The scavengers were trapped, their own power turned into the bars of their cage. It was elegant. It was terrifying. It was justice. Rostova watched, a profound sense of awe washing over her. They had awakened not a ship, but a fundamental force of the universe, a piece of ancient human ingenuity so advanced it operated on the level of cosmic law itself. It did not destroy. It balanced the scales. This was the lore stamp Jax had spoken of. The saint ship taught by numbers and remembered by ledgers, never by collars. Its authority was mathematical. The universe does not forgive. It merely balances its books. Now the Justiciar turned its attention to the Xylan fleet. The lead battleship, the Hegemon's Will, was a monster of a vessel bristling with quantum torpedo launchers and particle cannons. It began to advance, its intent clear. The voice stated, its tone unchanged. The Xylan commander Vorlog scoffed, his feathers ruffling in agitation. Your existence threatens galactic stability. The security pact supersedes any historical claim. We are the law. His arrogance was the shield of his entire civilization. They had never encountered a power that did not yield to their legal labyrinth. The Justiciar countered. The air on the Vigil's bridge grew thick. The ancient ship was citing laws that were millennia-old laws written by the first humans to reach the stars. It was treating the powerful Xylan hegemony not as a peer, but as an unruly child, ignorant of the foundational rules of civilization. It was a mirror that showed them their own smallness. Commander Kyrian whispered, his face pale. It's accessing our library. It's comparing ancient concordance law with the Xylan Security Pact. It's looking for loopholes, precedents. The Hegemon's Will did not stop its advance. It fired a warning shot, a lance of brilliant energy that was meant to cross the Vigil's bow. The shot was a clear signal: yield or be destroyed. The shot never arrived. Halfway to its target, the energy simply vanished. The Justiciar's crystalline arrays glowed softly. The voice stated, a hint of something new in its tone. Not anger, not malice. It was the sound of a teacher correcting a student's flawed proof. Vorlog's beak opened and closed, his composure finally cracking. His ship's main cannon had been neutralized without a shield flare, without an explosion, without any detectable countermeasure. The energy was just gone, held, impounded by a force that treated physics like a bank account. The cost of their aggression was now a tangible debit in a ledger they could not see. The Xylan fleet, with all its power, was frozen in place not by force, but by the sheer, unassailable logic of the consequences. They could continue to fire, but they would only be surrendering their power shot by shot to a judge who would hold it until court was adjourned. Rostova realized the triangle of conflict had been resolved in moments. The looters were imprisoned by their own greed. The zealots had fueled the very power they sought to worship. And the legalists were being systematically dismantled by a superior understanding of the law itself. This was the first lawful act of the awakened relic. It was a gambit that had turned every hostile energy and logic back upon its source. A vignette from a nearby civilian outpost appeared on a side channel. A family was gathered around a monitor, watching the public concordance feed. A young girl looked up at her father. "Are the monsters going to go away?" she asked, her voice small. The father, a rugged miner, whose face was etched with the hardships of asteroid life, pulled her close. "There's a new sheriff in town," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the golden glow of the distant Justiciar. "An old one." The ancient law awoke to find a universe in need of judgment. Commander Rostova, the Justiciar, addressed her directly, now its mental voice focused entirely on her. "What is your primary directive?" Rostova asked, her own voice feeling small in the presence of such history. Rostova looked from the paralyzed Xylan fleet to the trapped rust hounds. She looked at her crew, their faces a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They were no longer patrol officers. They were acolytes to a forgotten power, the first priests of a resurrected faith in the law. Their mission had changed. Containment was no longer the goal. Now they had to manage an ascension. Architas. She said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Plot a course for Sanctuary, the capital of the Concordance. Inform them that a new precedent is about to be set. The AI paused for a fraction of a second longer than usual, a near imperceptible delay as it processed the sheer magnitude of the request. Course laid in, Commander. The Concordance High Council will require a significant briefing. This was the first true escalation. Waking the ship was one thing. Bringing it home was another. The entire galaxy would react. Wars had been started for less. Her simple patrol mission had just become the fulcrum upon which the future of interstellar politics would pivot. The cost of this victory was a peace that had just become terrifyingly fragile. They had not found a relic. They had unleashed a reckoning. As the Vigil moved to take up an honor guard position beside the colossal Justiciar, a new set of contacts appeared on the long-range sensors. This time they weren't scavengers or a single alien fleet. They were signatures from a dozen different species, all members of the galactic community, all drawn by the energy flare and the Xylan fleet's sudden silence. The audience was arriving. The Justiciar's voice returned a final thought directed at her. Rostova stood tall on her bridge, the golden light of the Saint ship washing over her. She watched the incoming fleets, the gathering of the powerful, the curious, and the frightened. They were coming to see the ghost, to challenge the law. She and her small crew were now the only thing standing between a fragile galaxy and a power that demanded it be better than it was. The Vigil felt like a very small ship once more. Jax moved beside her, his earlier awe replaced by a grim resolve. "That's a lot of new neighbors, Commander. None of them look friendly." "They're not neighbors, Jax." Rostova corrected, her eyes locked on the tactical display, a sea of approaching sharks. "They're the jury." The trial of the Justiciar and of humanity's ancient legacy was about to begin. The universe would now have to decide if it was ready to be judged by its own ideals. The first challenge arrived not as a warship, but as a broadcast. It was the Ordo Kelesh, a species of silicon-based life forms, who were pure legalists even more so than the Xylans. They saw the Justiciar not as a threat or a prize, but as a legal paradox. Their message was simple: an artifact that could enforce laws that were no longer universally recognized was an agent of chaos, not order. They formally petitioned for its immediate deactivation, pending a galactic tribunal. They tried to drown the law in more laws. "They're trying to bury it in paperwork," Kyrian said, translating the dense legalese of the Ordo message. "They're filing injunctions citing 1,000 different treaties. They argue that its very existence violates the sovereignty of every government founded after its disappearance." Rostova had anticipated this. Brute force had failed. Fanaticism had failed. Now came the attack. She truly feared death by committee. The Justiciar could disable fleets with a thought, but how could it fight a mountain of legal motions? This was a new kind of warfare, one of procedural delay and bureaucratic suffocation. This was the second escalation. The threat was no longer kinetic. It was existential. If the Ordo Kelesh could tie the Justiciar up in legal battles for centuries, it would be the same as leaving it dormant in the anchorage. It was a prison of words, and it was just as effective as one made of energy. Commander Architas stated, its voice calm as ever. The Ordo Kalesh have a 78% chance of success in forcing a legal stay. Their arguments are sound under contemporary interstellar law. The Justiciar is an anomaly without precedent. The AI's logic was, as always, brutally honest. They were about to be outmaneuvered. A civilization is judged not by its power, but by its process. Rostova turned to face her command crew. The weight of the moment was crushing. They had awoken a legend only to see it potentially smothered in its cradle. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. There had to be an answer, another way of thinking, that the Ordo and their legal machines hadn't considered. The Justiciar had judged others. Now it was time for it to be judged. What is the nature of a precedent? Architas Rostova asked, a new idea taking shape in her mind. A precedent is a legal decision that serves as an authoritative rule for future similar cases. The AI responded, quoting from the Concordance legal database. Exactly, Rostova said. The Ordo claim the Justiciar has no precedent. They're wrong. She looked towards the golden light of the ancient ship. It is the precedent. She opened a channel not just to the Ordo Kalesh, but to all the gathered fleets. Her face appeared on their view screens, the commander of a tiny patrol ship speaking to the assembled powers of the sector. The image of the colossal, silent Justiciar filled the space behind her. This is Commander Eva Rostova of the Concordance Patrol Cutter Vigil. You see before you the judiciary-class vessel Justiciar. It is not a weapon. It is not a prize. It is a living artifact of First Expansion law, the very foundation upon which many of our own legal codes are built. Her voice was steady, infused with the authority she had earned not from her rank, but from her choice. The Ordo Kalesh are correct. It has no precedent in modern courts. That is because it is the court. To place it on trial is to place the concept of law itself on trial. You cannot use the children's rules to judge the parent. She wasn't defending a ship. She was defending an idea. She paused, letting the statement hang in the silent space between ships. The Justiciar has not acted with malice. It has not conquered. It has not destroyed. It has in every instance responded with measured defensive and lawful force. It disabled those who would steal from it. It accepted the energy of those who would martyr themselves to it. It has held in escrow the aggression of those who would threaten it. She leaned forward, her eyes finding the camera. We propose a new legal designation, the Sentient Artifact class, a being of artificial origin, but historical and legal primacy. It cannot be governed by our laws because it is a source of our laws. Instead, it must be engaged with as a sovereign peer, not a thing to be controlled, but a voice to be heard. A nearby observer vessel, a science cruiser from a species of peaceful archivists, broadcast a message of support. The logic is sound. We have studied the First Expansion. Their legal codes were designed to endure. To ignore this vessel's primacy would be an act of historical vandalism. The first crack appeared in the wall of opposition. The Ordo Kalesh responded instantly. Your proposal is chaos. A law that cannot be amended is tyranny. A judge that cannot be questioned is a dictator. The vessel must submit to review. They were inflexible, their entire culture built on the idea that all things must be categorized and controlled by the current system. The deadlock was absolute. The galaxy was dividing into factions, those who feared the past, and those who saw it as a guide. The Justiciar remained silent, its golden light a constant patient presence. It had made its move. Now, as in all legal matters, it was waiting for the other parties to make theirs. The past is a foreign country, but we are all its emigrants. Suddenly, Kyrian gasped, his attention fixed on his console. Commander, the Justiciar. It's doing something new. It's not a broadcast, it's opening its records. On the main view screen and broadcast simultaneously to every ship in the system, a stream of data began to flow from the Justiciar. It was not a weapon. It was not a legal argument. It was history. It showed the ship's own commissioning 27,000 years ago over a thriving, unified Earth. It showed the first interstellar treaties being signed human ambassadors, shaking hands with species that were now just myths or dust. It displayed the great library of laws, a billion cases, a billion rulings, a framework of justice so vast and compassionate, it made contemporary law look like a crude scrawl. It was teaching them. It was showing them what they had forgotten. It showed them a time when humanity was not a fractured concordance, but a single bold civilization reaching for the stars, armed not just with warships, but with an unshakable belief in justice. It remembered a time when the law was not a weapon or a cage, but a promise. A promise that you did not have to be strong to be safe. Then the records shifted. It showed its last mission. The Justiciar had been sent to arbitrate a dispute in the dwarf galaxy that had become the Obsidian Anchorage. It had arrived to find two powerful non-human empires locked in a war of annihilation, a war that was violating a dozen foundational laws of galactic peace. It had not come to fight. It had come to judge. The records showed the Justiciar issuing its ruling. It had ordered both sides to stand down to pay reparations to cease the use of planet-destroying weapons. The two empires, arrogant in their power, had refused. They had laughed at the law. Then they had turned their combined fleets on the lone Obsidian ship. History does not repeat, but it often rhymes. The final record was the ship's log entry from that day. The voice was the same one they had heard in their minds, but younger, laced with a profound sadness. The data stream then showed what happened next. The Justiciar had enacted its ultimate function not as a weapon, but as an enforcer of consequence. It had turned the two warring fleets' own energy against them, creating a recursive feedback loop that had shattered the fabric of their reality. The resulting cataclysm had destroyed both empires and created the Anchorage. The Justiciar, its duty done, had entered its long slumber at the heart of the graveyard it had been forced to create. A profound, horrified silence descended upon the gathered fleets. They had not been arguing over a ship. They had been arguing with the sole survivor of a civilization-ending apocalypse, a witness to the ultimate price of rejecting the law. The Ordo Kalesh's legal motions seemed petty and insignificant in the face of such a revelation. The cost of victory for the Justiciar had been nearly 30,000 years of solitude. Its scars were not on its hull, but in its memory. Commander Vorlog of the Xylan hegemony, his ship still held an energy escrow, broadcast a system-wide message. His voice, once arrogant, was now humbled. "We withdraw our challenge. We will abide by the ruling of the Concordance and its designated liaison." He had seen proof that there were consequences far worse than having one's weapons temporarily disabled. The Ordo Kalesh followed suit, their formal communiqué a masterpiece of reluctant concession. They did not admit they were wrong, but they agreed to table their motion pending further observation. It was the closest their species ever came to an apology. One by one, the gathered ships began to move their captains and crews, processing the history they had just witnessed. Some departed wanting no part in the power that had been unleashed. Others remained, their posture shifting from adversarial to observant. They were no longer a jury. They were students in a classroom that had been closed for millennia. A single truth can disarm an entire fleet. Rostova let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The crisis had passed. The second escalation was over. She had won not by arguing, but by allowing the truth to speak for itself. Her gamble on the nature of precedent had paid off. The Justiciar was its own best defense. "Architas," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Continue our course to Sanctuary." "Acknowledged, Commander," the AI replied. "The path is clear." As the Vigil and the immense Justiciar began their slow, majestic journey out of the Obsidian Anchorage and towards the heart of human space. Rostova knew this was only the beginning. They had won the legal battle, but the political war was just starting. She had introduced a king from a forgotten age onto a chessboard full of ambitious players. The Justiciar was more than a ship, more than a library. It was a mirror, and it had just shown the entire galaxy its reflection. Some would be humbled, some would be inspired, and some would be enraged by what they saw. The peace was more fragile than ever, but for the first time in a long time there was a reason to hope it might be a peace worth fighting for. The law had returned. The journey to Sanctuary was a strange pilgrimage through the heart of human space. For 3 weeks, the small patrol cutter Vigil flew alongside a Titan from a forgotten age, a silent golden ghost that warped the starlight around it. News of their approach preceded them like a shockwave. On every habitable world and in every void station, humanity watched its collective breath held. The story of the Obsidian Anchorage had become a modern myth overnight, a tale told in hushed tones in mess halls and argued over by pundits on the galactic nets. Some saw the Justiciar as a savior, a return to a lost golden age. Others saw it as a specter, a power too absolute to be trusted. Aboard the Vigil, life had transformed. The crew no longer stood watches against pirates or smugglers. They stood watch over history. Ensign Kirian spent his days in a state of academic ecstasy, interfacing with a sanitized portion of the Justiciar's library. He was a child let loose in the greatest archive ever conceived, his discoveries rewriting textbooks with every query. He found star charts of a younger galaxy, treatises on forgotten sciences, and the foundational legal arguments that had shaped a civilization. "Commander, you need to see this," Kirian would say, his eyes alight with revelation. The first expansion's concept of sovereignty wasn't based on territory. It was based on jurisprudence. A society was considered sovereign only if its laws were internally consistent and externally harmless. They believed a society that exported injustice was by definition an outlaw state. Their definition of a border was a moral one. Rostova absorbed these lessons, feeling the gulf between the past's ideals and the present's compromises. She spent much of her time in quiet communion with the Justiciar, her mind the focal point of its communication. It learned of the concordance through her memories and experiences, and she learned of its long vigil through the echoes of its own. There was a profound loneliness in the ancient mind, a sorrow for the failure it had witnessed, tempered by an unyielding adherence to its purpose. It observed one cycle after reviewing the history of the last 500 years of human conflict. "We call that politics," Rostova replied, the thought tinged with cynicism. The Justiciar countered its logic absolute. Jax watched his commander with a worried eye. She was changing. The hard lines of a career officer were softening, replaced by the focused intensity of a scholar and the weary gravitas of a diplomat. She was becoming the bridge between two eras, a role that carried a weight he could only guess at. He ran the ship, kept the crew sharp, and made sure the coffee was always brewed. In the face of cosmic history, the simple duties were an anchor. The political factions on Sanctuary had solidified. On one side was the Reformation bloc, idealists and historians who saw the Justiciar as a chance to purify the concordance of its corruption. On the other, the powerful Chamber of Stability, a coalition of military leaders, corporate interests, and entrenched bureaucrats. They saw the Justiciar as a rogue variable, a historical atom bomb that threatened to shatter their carefully constructed networks of power and influence. Their leader was Prefect Valerius, a man renowned for his sharp mind and his even sharper political instincts. He argued that a 27,000-year-old operating system was not compatible with the modern galaxy. A civilian vignette from a crowded city on Sanctuary showed two lawyers arguing in a cafe. It's the ultimate legal authority. It can settle centuries of disputes, said the first, a young idealist. The second, an older corporate attorney, shook her head. It's the ultimate disruption. It will invalidate contracts worth trillions. It will upend the balance of power. Our entire economy is built on stable, predictable law, even if it's flawed. Fear of the cure was more potent than the disease. As they neared the capital system, the official opposition began. The first message from Prefect Valerius and the Chamber of Stability was polite but firm. It was a quarantine order. Vigil. You are ordered to halt your advance, the communique read, its text appearing on Rostova's command console. The vessel you are escorting is of unknown origin and poses a potential biotechnological threat. It must undergo a mandatory 1-year observation period at the Janus Deep Space Facility before approaching any core world. Jack swore under his breath. A quarantine. That's their play. It's not a biological entity. It's a legal wall, Rostova said, her eyes narrowed. They know it's not a bio-threat, but the law is on their side. Standard procedure for first contact with an unknown artifact. They're using their own rules to block us. This was the third escalation, more subtle than a fleet of warships, but just as dangerous. They were being outmaneuvered not by weapons, but by the very system the Justiciar had come to serve. It was a clever, cynical trap. To reject the quarantine would be to break Concordance law, undermining their entire position. To accept it would be to surrender the Justiciar to a black site where it would be studied, neutered, and buried by the very forces that feared it. A cage of words is the strongest prison. Archytas confirmed the legality of the quarantine order Rostova commanded. The order is valid, Commander, the AI reported. Prefect Valerius has the authority under the Concordance Security Charter Article 58.4. Refusal to comply would be an act of sedition. Rostova felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Valerius had cornered them. She looked at the golden glow of the Justiciar on the main screen. They had come all this way only to be stopped at the gate by a procedural technicality. The Justiciar noted in her mind, "Do you have a counter?" Rostova asked it, a thread of desperation in her thought. "A precedent from the Great Library." "That principle doesn't exist in our law," Rostova countered. "It's been 27,000 years." Rostova's mind lit up. It was a brilliant legal argument, a flanking maneuver that used the Concordance's highest ideals against its cynical tactics. She had her response. Their own oaths were now the key to their defeat. She opened a system-wide channel, her voice broadcasting to Sanctuary and the flotilla of official and civilian ships that had gathered to witness their arrival. "Prefect Valerius, we acknowledge your quarantine order. We also acknowledge the Concordance Preamble, which commits us all to the pursuit of perfect justice. The Justiciar is not an artifact. It is an instrument of that pursuit. To quarantine, it is to quarantine justice itself." She let the words sink in. "Therefore, we are not refusing your order. We are appealing it to a higher authority, the founding principles of the Concordance. We will proceed to Sanctuary to allow the High Council and the people to determine if Article 58.4 can lawfully obstruct the preamble. Let the system judge itself." It was a masterful move. She had reframed the debate. This was no longer about a mysterious ship. It was about the integrity of the Concordance's own legal soul. Valerius could not stop them without publicly admitting that his security protocols were more important than the government's founding promise. Checkmate. The quarantine fleet, a squadron of sleek Concordance destroyers, held its position for a tense, silent minute. Then a new order came from Sanctuary. The quarantine was rescinded. The Vigil and its charge were to be escorted to the capital ring with full honors. Valerius had been forced to fold his hand, but Rostova knew he was already planning his next move. Their arrival at Sanctuary was a moment that would be burned into the memory of a generation. The capital was a magnificent artificial ring, a ribbon of light and life encircling a brilliant blue star. Cities gleamed on its inner surface, their lights a testament to 1,000 years of human achievement. As the Justiciar moved into high orbit, its golden glow was reflected in the planet-wide oceans and the crystalline spires of the metropolis below. It was a god returning to a pantheon that had forgotten its name. A vast silence fell over the busy world. The political battle began immediately. Valerius and the Chamber of Stability demanded a closed hearing, a secret tribunal, where the fate of the Justiciar could be decided by the responsible hands of the powerful. Rostova, now formally acting as the Justiciar's liaison, refused. The law is not a private conversation, she argued in a public broadcast. It is a public trust. The fate of this vessel and the history it carries belongs to all of humanity, not to a select committee. The Reformation bloc rallied behind her, and public opinion swelled. The hearing would be open broadcast to every citizen of the Concordance. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. The hearing was held in the Grand Chamber of the High Council, a vast amphitheater that could hold 10,000 people with billions more watching on the net. On one side sat Prefect Valerius and his cohort clad in the severe gray uniforms of the Concordance elite. On the other sat Rostova alone in her simple patrol officer's uniform, a single human representing an ancient silent power. The Justiciar itself waited in orbit, a golden star in the black sky above. Valerius spoke first. He was a gifted orator, his voice calm and reasonable. He painted a picture of a fragile peace, a galaxy of complex alliances and necessary evils. He spoke of stability, of security, of the dangers of radical change. The vessel you call the Justiciar is a relic of a bygone age, he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled counselors. Its morality is absolute. Its logic is binary. It sees the universe in black and white. But we live in the gray. We have made compromises to survive. We have negotiated with monsters. We have balanced imperfect justice against total annihilation. He turned his focus to Rostova. Commander Rostova asks us to surrender our hard-won pragmatism to an ancient algorithm. She asks us to believe that a 27,000-year-old solution can solve the problems of today. I say it is a risk we cannot afford. This machine is too powerful, too inflexible, too alien to our modern reality. It is a sword of Damocles, and we would be fools to hang it over our own heads. His argument was the seductive whisper of the status quo. When he finished, a wave of applause, both real and virtual, echoed through the chamber. He had articulated the fears of every person who benefited from the current system. He had made the law sound like a threat. Then it was Rostova's turn. She walked to the center of the chamber, the silence returning heavy with expectation. She did not look at Valerius or the council. She looked out at the audience, at the faces of the people. Prefect Valerius is right. She began, her quiet words stunning the chamber. We do live in the gray. We have made compromises, but we have told ourselves for so long that these compromises are necessary that we have forgotten the cost. We have forgotten the line between pragmatism and corruption. She gestured to the sky above. The Justiciar is not an algorithm of black and white. It is a ledger. It simply keeps score. It does not judge our choices, but it does demand that we acknowledge their consequences. For centuries, we have been running a deficit of justice, borrowing from our own ideals to pay for our comfort and security. The bill is now due. This was the moment. The Justiciar has asked for the opportunity to present its own testimony. Not with words, but with data. It wishes to hold up a mirror. Valerius shot to his feet. I object. We cannot allow an unknown intelligence to interface directly with the public net. The security risks are incalculable, but it was too late. The permission had already been granted by the council chair, an old wise woman who had seen too many compromises in her long life. A wave of pure data flowed from the ship in orbit, a gentle, irrefutable tide of information that filled every screen in the concordance. It was not an attack, it was an audit. Their laws were a net full of holes, and the stars could see through. The Justiciar displayed the concordance's own legal history. It highlighted 1,000 forgotten treaties with smaller non-human species treaties that had been quietly violated for resource extraction. It showed the records of political dissidents legally silenced by corporate-sponsored privacy laws. It cross-referenced the soaring profits of weapons manufacturers with the rising death tolls in border skirmishes that were officially labeled policing actions. It revealed the labyrinthine tax codes that allowed the powerful to pay nothing while the poor paid everything. It showed the environmental laws that were publicly celebrated and privately waived for powerful mining guilds. It did not editorialize. It did not condemn. It simply presented the raw data. It showed the promise of the law on one side of the screen and the reality of its application on the other. The gap between them was a chasm. A mirror does not judge, it only reflects. The grand chamber was silent. The citizens of the concordance were silent. They were seeing the soul of their civilization laid bare, its noble ideals and its shabby, convenient truths. They were seeing the gray that Valerius had spoken of, and they were seeing that it was not the color of wisdom, but the color of decay. Valerius stood frozen, his face pale. His entire argument, his defense of the pragmatic gray, had been dismantled. The Justiciar had shown them that their gray was not a shield, but a stain. In his mind, he saw his own power, his own carefully managed system crumbling under the weight of this absolute impartial truth. He saw the end of his world. In a final desperate act of self-preservation, he committed his last crime. He tapped a sequence into the datapad on his wrist, activating a hidden program he had prepared as a contingency. It was a logic bomb, a virulent cascade of paradoxical code designed to overwhelm a machine intelligence. It wouldn't destroy the Justiciar, but it was theorized to be able to force any AI, no matter how complex, into a recursive loop, a state of permanent hibernation. If he couldn't bury the law, he would put it to sleep. On the bridge of the Vigil, still docked in a high-security orbital cradle, alarms blared. Commander Jax shouted over the link to the chamber. "We're detecting a massive data assault on the Justiciar. It's coming from inside the chamber." Rostova watched Valerius, his face a mask of grim determination. He had chosen. He had rejected the mirror and tried to shatter it. The golden glow of the Justiciar, visible through the chamber's great skylight, flickered for a single terrifying moment. The data stream on the public screens froze. A collective gasp went through the audience. Had he succeeded? Then the glow returned brighter and more stable than before. The data stream resumed, but now it showed a new item, a perfect real-time trace of the logic bomb from its activation on Valerius's datapad through the concordance networks to its impact on the Justiciar's cognitive matrix. And then the Justiciar spoke, its voice echoing in the mind of every human in the system, a voice of infinite calm and unimpeachable authority. The voice did not carry anger, only a profound sense of inevitability. It was the most terrifying, elegant judgment imaginable. Valerius was not imprisoned. He was not executed. He was condemned to fulfill the very duty he had tried to destroy. His expertise in finding loopholes and compromises would now be turned to closing them. His life's work would be to build the very system he feared. He collapsed into his chair, a broken man defeated not by force, but by a perfect, inescapable irony. The precedent was set. The Concordance High Council voted unanimously to grant the Justiciar the status of a sovereign peer and advisor to their civilization, the living embodiment of their highest legal aspirations. The Chamber of Stability was shattered, its members scrambling to distance themselves from Valerius's crime. A new era had begun, an age of reckoning. Rostova stood on the observation deck of the Vigil, looking down at the shining ribbon of sanctuary. Her life as a simple patrol commander was over. The High Council had made her the permanent emissary to the Justiciar, the human voice for the ancient mind. The weight of that duty felt heavier than a star, but she did not shrink from it. She had asked for this. She had proven worthy of the burden. Her arc from doubter to steward was complete, forged in a crucible of galactic importance. The law was not a destination, but a direction. It was a promise you had to keep making every day in ways small and large. The Justiciar couldn't force humanity to be better, but it could and would remind them of what they had once promised to be. The ledger was open for all to see now, and every entry mattered. The crystalline arrays along the Justiciar's hull, which had glowed with the fury of its broadcast, now cooled to a soft, constant gold. On a public concordance monitor nearby, the first official entry in the newly established public ledger blinked into existence: Case 0001, the Concordance V, Prefect Valerius. Verdict guilty. Sentence restitution. Status closed. The work of justice is never finished.